Happy Friday, everyone. So everybody else look forward to Fridays? Don't get me wrong, I enjoy teaching. I look forward to Mondays and to a lesser degree, even though I complain about Wednesdays, I look forward to them. But Fridays is where it's at. That's usually to save the fun stuff for Friday. If I was really smart, I would do the really boring stuff on Friday because then you get the boring stuff out of the way and you got the weekend. But unfortunately, I do the tedious stuff on Mondays and Wednesdays. So I don't know. Maybe you guys find Excel fun, maybe you don't. Hopefully you find it a little bit engaging. But we got Excel today and our first AI assignment. I'll learn a little bit about that. I don't really think I have any announcements today. I think we're up to date. Hopefully everybody remembered to check their Meet the Firm stuff and everybody got their grades sorted out. Again, email me if you have a problem. And remember, 2 weeks, a little bit less than 2 weeks. That's when we have the Career Fair Expo. We'll try to remind you, keep reminding you of it, but I am notoriously unreliable when it comes to reminders. So hopefully you've got that reminder set for yourself. Does anybody ever use like their calendar app on their phone to set reminders for themselves? That's basically the only way I remember anything. I wake up in the morning, it was, what's my name? Michael Barnes. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's kind of where we're at right there. All right, today we're going to be doing some Excel stuff. We're still kind of in the remedial stuff, and that's fair. We're going to get a little bit more detailed in some things today, some things that you may or may not be familiar with. But let's talk about grammar and Excel. So one problem with Excel that constantly happens, and I alluded to this last week, is that Excel does not follow English grammar rules. So the way that we would speak something in the English language versus the way that we dictate it in Excel are not going to be the same thing. And this is certainly problematic. So remember last week we were talking about concat function, and I said the optimal situation for a concat function is to say, all right, start with a particular item, and then add the next item afterwards. Instead, you have to start with this word concat to actually clarify what it is you're trying to do with the terms. And this is going to be true for a lot of things in Excel. I believe that this comes down to the background or the functions in the background. That's what I'm trying to say of Excel. So anybody who doesn't know, Excel is built on Visual Basic. And so whenever you do something in Excel, it types out a line of code. Now, not literally types out a line of code, it creates a line of code that it runs. And so this can enable some very, very powerful things. For example, you can create macros because you can actually copy the line of code and then repeat those lines of code with variable inputs. So this can be very, very helpful, but it also gets a little bit confusing because effectively you are going to have to meet the programming parameters of Visual Basic when you write Excel functions. It is fairly straightforward, but it does require some explanation. So let's go ahead and do probably my favorite function of all time. I shouldn't say favorite. My favorites are probably the lookup function, specifically VLOOKUP. But the one that I use the most is definitely the if function. So if basically is just our standard parsing function, and it parses information, says if a certain condition is met, then you return a result. So as you can see here, I've got our instructors up here with their disciplines, and we're going to use that for our function creation. So let's do a very, very silly if function. I'm going to do equals if, open parentheses. And for our logical test, we're just going to say, Dr. Barnes has to teach AIS, which makes sense because I'm teaching AIS. So B2 equals, and in open quotes AIS, because we are looking at text fields here. So we have to make sure they match on text fields. All right. If that is correct, then we're going to go Homer Simpson and just go woohoo. People still watch The Simpsons, by the way. They're like almost as old as I am. And like I said, I figure if I'm using a Simpsons reference, I have to preface that saying, does anybody ever watch that anymore? We're actually to the point now that Simpsons is about to go off the air. And now I'm going to say Simpsons and people are just going to look at me blankly. I don't know. I always preferred Futurama. So you hear me say quotes from that randomly, but think though that's a little bit dated as well. Then to close our function, we'll say boo. Actually, boo earns, which is really funny if you know anything about The Simpsons. But if you don't know anything about The Simpsons, you're gonna be like, Dr. Barnes is such a dork, which that's a true statement too. All right. So basically, AIS is met. If I change this, so if I just delete this, or if I put in worse yet, put tax. Okay. So I try to assign Dr. Barnes to tax, everybody's going to be saying boo. Everybody's going to be saying boo. Yeah. So yeah, that's a basic if function, which I'm not doing anything too profound here. Now let's go ahead and look at and or functions. Now, and or functions are exactly what they seem. They're basically parsing functions that look for conditions to be met. In the case of and, it's looking for both conditions or however many conditions you put in. in OR functions is looking for at least one of the conditions to be met. So let's go ahead and do a basic AND function. Equals and for AND function, we're just going to say Dr. Otero has to be teaching managerial. And Dr. Eisen has to be teaching financial. So B4 equals managerial in quotes, B5 equals financial in quotes. If both those conditions are met, it comes back with a true statement. Now, if I change either one of those conditions, it's going to come back with a false statement. Either of those conditions are not met, then it comes out false. So if I suddenly assign Dr. Eisen to be managerial, actually, I don't know. Dr. Eisen's so chill, he'd be like, I'm cool with that. I think I could teach managerial. If anybody actually had Dr. Eisen for class, that's exactly how he would be. I'm working on my Dr. Eisen impression. It's gotten better over the years. Like, yeah, I don't think I could teach a managerial. I think I could do a good job with that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Been working 10 years at it. All right. So what about the OR function? All right. So OR functions got some versatility here. So let's go ahead and we're going to do a single condition OR statement. We're also going to do multiple condition OR statements. So let's do the multiple condition first, because that's going to be the most use case. So let's go ahead and do the exact same statement we did above, but we're going to do OR. All right. So we're going to do OR. So Dr. Otero has to be teaching managerial. My spelling gets worse as I get older. Or Dr. Eisen has to be teaching financial. So basically, one of these two conditions has to be true. And again, these are not limited to two conditions. You can actually have any number of conditions. It could be 3, 5, 1,000 if you had the patient's time by 1,000 conditions. But you could type out multiple conditions and would say all conditions have to be true, or says at least one has to be true. So in this particular situation, if I delete managerial for Dr. Eisen or for Dr. Otero, excuse me, you'll notice the and statement turned false, but or remain true. Same thing, if I delete financial here, the and statement remains false, then true. If I delete both of them, that's when we say false, because neither one of them are true. Now, I said that there are two dimensions to this, so that's a multi-condition function. What about a single condition function with multiple parameters? That is also available for OR. So let's go ahead and do another OR statement below the first one. So we're going to stick with Dr. Otero. Dr. Otero equals managerial. Oh my gosh. No, most people aren't watching, but anybody who's watching on YouTube is just we kind of like, oh my gosh, he cannot spell with to save his life. And it's true, I can't. It's not that I can't spell, I just can't type effectively. I never learned how to type. So we're going to say managerial. We're also going to say cost, because Dr. Otero teaches cost accounting. Now, what's the difference between managerial and cost accounting? It's the spelling, okay? The spelling. They're identical, no matter what Dr. Otero says. They're the same thing, okay? The exact same thing. So in that situation, if it says managerial, it's good. If it says cost, it's also good. If it says nothing, that's where we have a false statement. So that's a single condition with multiple parameters. Now, those are all fine functions. They're pretty straightforward and intuitive. Where you get really your power in Excel, and I mentioned this last week, is when you combine functions together. And so we're going to be doing some of that this semester. This is going to be the first step. We're going to actually look and see how we can actually combine our parsing functions to get some a little bit more availability. So we're going to do if, and if, or. So let's just go ahead and do an if, and statement. All right. So I'm going to start equals if, and then we open parentheses. We have to open up parentheses and do our formula for and. So if and parentheses and, you don't need another equal sign. We'll automatically just pick up that parameter. All right. So let's just go ahead and assume that Dr. Barnes has to be teaching AIS. Oops, make sure you add your equal sign. That's problematic. It's not going to work otherwise. And Dr. Caden has to be teaching tax. Believe it or not, there was a time in Dr. Caden's career before she became the department head that she taught other classes other than tax. Those days are now faded into history, but you have to believe me, they did exist. All right. Oops. Oh, I can't close that. I gotta say, what are my conditions? All right, so this is what if statement. So we close out that, we're gonna have our if statement. And we're gonna say thumbs up. But if it's not met, thumbs down. All right, so both of these conditions are met. But I'm gonna do something really, really mean. I'm gonna type in audit here, because I always like to try to make Dr. Caden an auditor. She definitely gives a thumbs down to that. She definitely gives a thumb down to that. We're gonna have to measure out one day more. So who dislikes the other discipline the most? Does she dislike auditing more, or do I dislike tax more? And I tell people I would not be opposed to teaching tax. My students would be opposed to me teaching them tax, because it would be like we teach a tax question. I'd be like, do you guys think that's correct or not? Because I would have no idea. I'd have no clue. No clue. Didn't you pass the CPA exam, Dr. Barnes? It was a long time ago. Long time ago. All right. So same thing with the if or statement. So I set up if or, set up our condition. Let's go ahead and say, this is a pretty easy one. Dr. Barnes has to be teaching AIS equals, and as I've alluded to many times already in this course, I also teach another accounting course, or another accounting discipline, audit. And if those one of those conditions are met, all good. Like next semester, I will not be teaching AIS, so want to make sure at least one of those conditions are met. If both those conditions are not met, all bad. What did I do wrong? Oh, forgot to put a parentheses around my AIS. Okay, there we go. All right, so here we have Dr. Barnes teaching AIS. If I switch that over to audit, still fine. It's when I get something else. By the way, the mythical Dr. Caden teaching something other than tax. There's also a mythical story that I used to teach something other than AIS or audit. That was true too. I actually taught managerial at one point. So yeah, those are the good old days. Those are the days. All right, so again, we're going to look at another form of the if function here in just a second, but let's go ahead and take an interlude and let's talk about the count and sum functions. Now, sum function, I'm not too worried about you knowing. I'm assuming that everybody can do a pretty basic sum function. But what about the count function? So there's different variations in the count function that we're going to use for different circumstances. Some of them are self-explanatory, some of them are a little bit more subtle. So let's do a basic count function. We're just going to count the number of number of homework submissions. Count. And we're going to highlight D2 through D7. So it looks like we got a count of 4. And the reason why we have a count of 4 is that count by definition only looks for numeric values. The count function only looks for numeric values. So the blank one for Michael Barnes does not count that one because it's a blank cell, but it also doesn't count my dog ate it, which is the submission for Stacy Caden. Has anybody ever met Stacy Caden's dog, Dr. Caden's dog? So you'd think it'd be named Fido, but it's actually named FIFO because she's an accountant. Yes, FIFO. Yeah, true story. Yeah. If you ever go over there for a barbecue, because the Cadens sometimes often for student or offer their property for student organizations, you get to meet FIFO. FIFO is not a good dog. Yeah. All right, let's do a count if. Count if is pretty basic. It is a little bit confusing in its setup though. So the range is going to be the same. We're just going to do D2 through D7. But when we set an equation, especially if we're doing numeric criteria, we still have to use parentheses because we're actually stating the equation within the parentheses. So in this case, I'm going to say equals 10. And it says 3. 3 equals 10. Yeah, COUNTIF is a little bit weird because it's actually asking for the criteria, the equation. So you generally have to type in the parentheses, the equation that's going to be the parameters. And those usually going to be not parentheses in quotation marks. That's what I meant to say, in quotation marks. Count blank is very easy. Count blank is just using the same parameters as the count function, except it's going to count the number of blanks, which is 1. Now count A. Count A is similar to count with one major difference. Remember we said count only counts the number of numeric arguments. Count A will count any argument, whether it's numeric or other format. So it's just looking for a value, whether it's numeric or alpha. We have 5. So the big one to remember there, the big deviations to remember there is going to be when do we use count, when do we use versus when do we use count A. Count is going to be more useful when we're trying to look for numeric values within an array. Count A will be looking for any value within an array, and you will encounter situations they'll come up. I will say honestly, out of all the functions that I've used the most, COUNTIF is probably the most frequent because usually we're trying to set conditions for when we count something. So that may be something that we encounter in the future, no pun intended. Literally, no pun intended. I just said it and I realized how silly it sounded. All right. Let's go ahead and do the SUMIF function. So the SUMIF function basically says if a certain criteria is met, it's going to add those values together. So equals SUMIF. I know that you've done more complex versions of this. We're not going to do SUMIFs or COUNTIFs, even though I know that you all did that in 153. We're going to stick to the pretty basic one because I think that this one's one of the more common usage. So D2 through D7 again. Criteria, I'm going to say equals 10 again. And then we're going to say sum range. We don't actually need to put anything in because we've already specified a range. So we're going to actually do another equation here in just a second. But if the sum range is the same as your criteria range, you don't need to put in a sum range. It's just going to default to that criteria range. So we have 30. Now, the neat thing about this function, the SUMIF function and the variance, SUMIFs, COUNTIFs, all those, is that we can actually dictate a different range for criteria and sum if we really want to. So let's go ahead and do another SUMIFs function. SUMIF function, just a SUMIF, not SUMIFs. Not trying to get you all storm out of the room in anger. All right, let's go ahead and highlight B2 through B7. We'll say our criteria is DEERS. Which I realize that's only one value there, but that's okay. And then our sum range is going to be D2 through D7. So anything that has the value of DEERS in B2 through B7, we're going to sum those together. Should only be one, because there's only one value of DEERS. But what happens if I flash fill this and make everything DEERS? Well, then it will add all those together. It's pretty basic. All right. Last Excel function for the day. This is my favorite one. We'll say the save for last. So combining functions can be very powerful. You can actually combine the same function in certain situations. And this is one we call a nested if function. And when I say nested if function, all that means is that we're going to use multiple if statements simultaneously. Have you all done this before? It is very, very powerful and can get very confusing if you mess up. Okay, so the situation that I use this most frequently is going to be when I'm assigning letter grades. Now, if I'm only dealing with 6 people, I can assign letter grade manually, and that's probably what I would do here. But what if I had 40 students, or like in the nightmare scenario when I was at Oklahoma State, when I had 140 students in a single class? It's just easier to write a formula for setting that up. So we're going to go ahead and do our own formula. So basically my criteria is that anything that's rounded to 90% or higher, and we'll see what that means here in just a second, is an A. Anything that's rounded to 80% or higher is a B, so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and set up our nested if statement. So we're going to do equals if, and our logical test is F2 is greater than, and I'm going to put 0.894, 8.894. Because I will round up from 0.895 or higher, and I think a tenth is probably good. Now you're saying, Dr. Barnes, this is the problem. What if it's 0.8945? You're basically getting somebody who's got technically not an 895 to round it up. I said, I'm not thinking that far ahead, okay? If they get an 8.8945, they've gamed the system, okay? I don't think that was their plan. I don't think that was plan. Plus, that's close enough for government work. All right. So equals 0.894. The value of true, well, we know what the value of true is. That's an A. What is the value of false? Well, we've got a whole bunch more grades to assign, so let's go ahead and go through these, all right? So next one is another if statement. Same thing, F2 This time needs to be greater than 0.794. If that's the case, it's going to be a B. Now this bears mentioning, all right? If I say 0.794, anything greater than 0.794 is automatically a B. Does that mean that anything that could potentially be an A now gets assigned to a B? No, because the first if statement precludes that. The first if statement basically sets a priority saying, here's the A's. If it's not an A, then we're going to look at everything else. So the fact that we've already signed out an A means that this if statement works well. Okay, so let's continue on. You can kind of see where we're going here. If F2 is greater than 0.694, then C. Otherwise, if 2 is greater than 0.594, then D. And usually what will happen here is I will write another if statement for any numeric value. Anything that has a numeric value after that is going to receive an F. I'm just going to put in the default as an F here. The only reason I do that is because if something comes in and it's not a numeric value, I don't want it automatically defaulting to F. I want to capture that as an error. But since I know all these are numeric values, I'm just going to go ahead and say F here. But usually I'll write another if statement, but that would get really confusing, so we're not going to do that. Then we're going to close all our parentheses, and we've got our letter grades. And because of relative cell references, we only have to write that once. And that is something that I do pretty frequently, at least once a semester. Actually, like 3 times a semester because I teach 3 classes. Now, are there other ways to go about this? Certainly, okay. There's certainly matching that we could do through here. We can actually set up a table to look for certain ranges, and then if it meets the range, then it comes back to the value. There's different ways to do this. This honestly has been the most efficient way without a template. I can just create the formula and set the nested if function up. So I'm a big fan of nested if functions, if nothing else, for teaching you logical precedence in programming. So that's why I'd use that. All right, and we're done with Excel for today. Another Excel assignment down. Moving on to the future. So we're going to talk about AI today. So start out with AI. One of the things that I ask you to do is to go to copilot.microsoft.com. It used to be if you were on the Truman Network, you had to sign into Copilot. I don't think that you have to do that anymore. I think it's publicly available without logging in. If you want to save your the text of your chats, you probably want to sign in. Otherwise, you have to copy and paste that into a separate document because it will save previous chats. For example, you can kind of see my chat here is that I asked it Copilot to summarize all the recherche de Halt Perdu, which I only know what that means because of a Monty Python sketch, honestly. But it's Marcel Proust's novel. It's like 4,000 something pages. And I said, okay, I'm curious if Copilot can actually summarize this in 3 sentences or less. And it actually did it. It did it, said it in 3 sentences. But just save your chats and we'll actually tell you what you've done recently. So if you want to sign in so you can save the context for this chat, then it's probably a good idea. Otherwise, it just occurred to me I want to start a new chat. So there we go. All right. So we're going to be doing some activity in Copilot, which again, I encourage you to save the activity for reference. If you don't want to sign in, what you want to do is at the end of the class session today, copy everything that you put into Copilot into a separate document so you have that for reference. So your choice. I'm not insistent on what you're going to do. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the concept of probabilistic outputs and temperature. And you're going to say, I know what temperature is, Dr. Barnes. It's like 86 degrees outside. That's not really what I'm referring to, but these are related concepts. And it comes from this book that I read by David Wood. He's actually an accounting professor at BYU, and he's kind of leading the forefront in AI and accounting. Some of the things that he said is repetitive and repeated of other AI professors that we're going to talk about. Some of the things he talked about is specific to business and accounting that's going to be very relevant to us. But I thought this was a good introduction to understand what it is that AI tools, specifically large language models, are doing. Now, does everybody can understand the concept of a large language model? Has anybody heard that term before? So AI tools are varied in scope. They have a lot of diversity in scope. But the ones that we use the most frequently, the ones that we usually call the AI tools, these are the ones that are called large language models. They take a lot of input and they summarize it and then provide outputs based on that. ChatGPT is kind of the first large language model, and everything else is kind of derived from that. Google's Gemini, Amazon's AI tool. I think Microsoft's Microsoft Copilot is based on that, and to a lesser extent, that's going to be true for Siri as well as Apple's use. Anything that takes information and returns a result that you can find through a query is kind of driven by these large language model tools now. And so when you hear me say LLM, all that is we're talking about a specific AI tool that we're using for this context. Now, LLMs are becoming more powerful, but as we're going to talk about in the next few weeks, they are not omnipotent or omniscient. They don't have presence in everywhere. They don't have full knowledge. They are limited by the data range and their own personal abilities. And I think when we talked about AI a few weeks ago in week one, I said the way that we think about AI tools is think about it like a grad student named Steve, who is really, really well versed at coding and art, that will make up stuff when you press them. Okay, so if you try to ask an LLM to do something other that's not outside of its expertise range, it will try to help you, but it may not be effective. And so that was kind of the hallucinations we talked about a few weeks ago. All right. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to input the following prompt into Copilot. Tell me a dad joke. I want you to do this 3 times. All right. Apparently some good dad jokes. To hear people chortling a little bit. Okay. Yes. I just copied it and pasted it. All right. Did anybody get the scarecrow joke for one of their jokes? That seems to be the default, like first one. Anytime to say dad joke. In fact, you will notice that if you go to the very last slide in the, there we go, scarecrow win an award. I've seen that many times already. All right. So what else we got? So the factory one is actually a pretty new one. I haven't seen this one. What do you call a factory that makes only okay products? A satisfactory. All right. Then I've seen the skeleton joke before because they don't have the guts. Why don't skeletons fight each other? Don't jokes. Anybody have one that was not on that list that they want to share? That's just like, okay, that was a good one. Or are those all pretty much consistent with what everybody had? Okay. So at least an interesting idea, because we said the same prompt 3 times and they gave us 3 different responses in some situations. In some situations, it will give us the same response twice. It'll give us another separate response. Sometimes it'll do the same one 3 times, which leads to question about why is it coming up with that? Okay. So let's go ahead and we're going to do something very similar, but we're going to adjust the phrase. So I want you to start out, I want you to do the following prompt. Write a sentence that begins with the phrase, the accountants worked long hours at the task of, and then leave it to Copilot to finish that. And I want you to do that 3 times as well. All right. Apparently I thought I was pasting an image instead of a text, but let's see, I'm just curious. If I copy this instead. Recognizing an image from PowerPoint because I just copied and pasted it there. All right. So it did come up. So when it's interesting. The reason I mentioned this. So when I put in the image, it recognized the words that were in the image, but it came up with the same response every single time. But when I copied actual text of it, It came up with a different one. So let's just go ahead and look at the different responses it came up with. And hopefully you came up with different responses. But accountant worked long hours with the task of meticulously auditing financial statements to ensure accuracy and compliance with regulations. Also, the accountant worked long hours with the task of reconciling complex financial discrepancies that have puzzled the entire audit team. Did anybody come up with something related to tax in their response? So I've done this a few times. I've come up with tax. I've come up with preparation of financial statements. This is actually one of the few times that it actually came up with auditing as the default response, which I thought was interesting because most people do not associate accounting with auditing. Most people associate accounting with tax. So apparently ChatGPT is one of the enlightened ones, or Copilot's the enlightened one, which is the base of ChatGPT. But so yeah, did anybody come up with auditing for one of their responses? How about financial statements? Did that come up? Yeah, financial statements came up. So interesting stuff, and there's some diversity in the responses. Now, this is an interesting question. If you were talking to a computer, just a rote computer, and you asked the same question 3 times, would you expect the same response to the query? Yeah, the way that computers operate is we assume that they're calculation operations, and so the responses are going to be the same responses that we have every single time. That's our conclusion. That's what our assumption is. But that's not what happened here. In this particular situation, we actually had different responses. So the way that I said this in the slides is that you receive different responses each time you're in a prompt, though the array of responses within the class is limited. And this is part of the due to generative AI tools being programmed to provide a variety in responses. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit this week and a little bit next week, but we're going to talk a little bit about some ways that this works. The reason why is because LLMs are not deterministic in outputs. So has anybody heard the word deterministic before? Deterministic means that it's going to result in a very specific conclusion. Like you can look at the inputs and you can say, I know what the output will be. Very, very easy way to think about it is a calculator. If you put 2 plus 2 into a calculator, what are you always going to get? It's on the screen, Dr. Barnes. You don't need to ask us that question. It's like, I can't believe I'm paying my tuition dollars to be asked 2 plus 2. No, it's very obvious. You're going to get 4. Calculator, so conversely, let's say you put 2 plus 2 into a calculator and got something other than 4, what would your conclusion be? The calculator is busted, okay? Calculator does not work. We rely on certain tools to be deterministic. We want to make sure that it comes up with the exact same response. To a lesser extent, Excel does the same thing. If we type a formula in Excel, we should get a determined result. If it gives us a different result, that our assumption is not that Excel is broken, but we've typed in the formula incorrectly. So deterministic outputs are very, very useful and can be very helpful in our usage, but that's not what LLMs do. LLMs do something called probabilistic output. Probabilistic output. So the idea behind probabilistic output is that you put in a query, you put in a prompt, and it comes up with any variety of responses. So when we did a dad joke, I came up with 3 different responses. Were they all dad jokes? Yes. Were they all the same dad joke? No. So they come up with different responses, and that's by design. The idea being is it's supposed to emulate more human behavior. Ask yourself, if I say, give me a dad joke, would the dad joke that you came up today be the same dad joke that you give me like 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, or say 2 years from now, 3 years from now? It's like, if it's a really good dad joke, I'm going to hold on to that for the rest of my life. Okay. So everybody's going to remember the scarecrow joke from now on. It's outstanding in its field. Yeah. So that's going to be the default dad joke. Yeah. All right. That's not going to be on the exam though, just so you know. Anyway, so what is it that actually sets probabilistic output? And that's actually temperature settings. That's what we call this in AI tools. All right. They can vary minimally or broadly depending on its temperature settings. Now, how do we actually determine temperature? What does this mean? Well, low temperatures are generally very technical and consistent, so it's more deterministic in nature, whereas high temperatures tend to be more creative and variable. Now, we cannot actually alter the temperature settings in Copilot. We can't go in and say, I want to change your temperature from 5 to 10. The temperature setting on Copilot set up, but we can give it some prompts to actually give it to make it be more creative. So I could say, please be more creative in responses, and the responses should be a little bit more diverse and a little bit more probabilistic rather than being more deterministic. So let's go ahead and test this puzzle. Let's go ahead and test this out, okay? So here's what I want you to do. This is the one where you're going to have to work on your own, but I want you to develop a prompt that requires a probabilistic output, so something that does not have a definitive answer. Enter your prompt into Copilot without any preparation or adjustment and see what the result is. Then I want you to rerun your prompt, okay? prefacing each co-pilot in response to be a more creative manner, a more technical manner, and then a balance between creative technical. So you're going to create a prompt, a probabilistic prompt, and then you're going to run it one time. Then you're going to say, co-pilot, be more creative in your responses. Run it again. Co-pilot, be more technical in your responses. Run it again, and then co-pilot, be more balanced between technical and creative, and then run it a fourth time. Everybody got that? All right, and the prompt is up to you. Let's see what kind of prompts you can come up with. All right, so if you're still working on your prompts, that's fine, but I'm going to talk real quick. So I decided to prompt, I said, in 3 sentences, please explain the advantages of an education from a liberal arts university. And it came up with a pretty balanced statement. It says, offers a broad foundation across disciplines, encouraging critical thinking and intellectual flexibility, foster strong communication and problem-solving skills, which are highly valued in diverse career path. Additionally, students benefit from smaller class size and closer interaction with faculty, enhanced personal growth and academic support. So would everybody agree that that's kind of been their experience at Truman State University? Didn't think you were going to ask me a question about this statement. Yeah, I thought you were just reading it, Dr. Barnes. So yeah, how about small class sizes? Everybody experienced that at Truman State? Yeah. Intellectual support, enhanced personal growth, interactions with faculty. Did the faculty ever interact with you? Well, there was one doing one right now, so I would assume that that's the case. Yes, okay. So yeah, it was a pretty good answer. Then I told it to be more creative. Now, what would you anticipate if you were trying to be more creative in that regard? How would you approach this particular question and be more creative? I know what I would do. I'd probably provide an analogy, which exactly what ChatGPT did. It said, like, education for liberal arts leaders is like planting a garden of ideas. Okay, students cultivate curiosity across disciplines. Okay, then equips them with the tools to think critically, write eloquently, and adapt to like Swiss Army knives. And boy, that's a really interesting analogy. Swiss Army knives. Has anybody ever owned a Swiss Army knife, by the way? Yeah, those things, they seem they're really cool for about 10 minutes, and then you're just kind of like, wow, this is bulky. Yeah. So I used to carry around my pocket, and then I just got tired of carrying it around. So yeah. Yeah. So then I said, all right, let's be a little bit more technical. And it gave a list of items that are advantages of a liberal arts university education. Interestingly, when I asked this prompt, it said, okay, here's the technical details. I'm going to ignore your 3 sentences or less criteria. So it basically said, okay, for technical details, I'm going to ignore some of the information. Then I went back and said, let's go ahead and balance between creativity and technical details. I got a response that's very similar to the first one. It's not identical to the first one, but it's very similar to the first one. It kind of embedded information that it had from its previous 2 responses. So what do you think this tells us about ChatGPT or Copilot? Is it more creative in nature, technical in nature, or is it more of a balance in nature? The default settings. I mean, given that I told it to be balanced between the two settings and the response that it gave me was similar to my very first prompt without any prompting, kind of tells us that it kind of strikes a balance between creative and technical. So is that useful information for us for the future? So let's say that you're working for a course, and you're working one of your business courses, like a capstone course, and your instructor says, "I want you to brainstorm ideas on how we can actually sell a particular product to the market." What would you be looking for? Would you be looking for technical ideas or creative ideas in that scenario? I would be looking for more creative ideas on how to do that. Yes.
Memorize what the user likes. So depending on how much you're using AI, it's going to give you the objective that you're going to learn from it.
Okay, that's good to know. So basically, it's tailoring itself to the user. So yeah, it's an important point. So if I specify that I want something creative, but I'm very technical in nature, then it's probably going to have to make a pretty big adjustment. Whereas if I'm already asking creative questions, it's going to provide a response to that. Now, what about technical details? If you were in Dr. Caden's class and she asked you about tax code, would you want creativity in that class? Tax is the enemy of creativity. So creative tax accountants go to jail. All right. So yeah, be very, very careful about that. So that's one thing we have to be very, very careful of, is that when we actually determine our temperature settings, that can actually be very helpful or very harmful, depending on what it is that we're trying to look for. So yeah, as we're moving forward, that's something that we're going to consider. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this concept in a little bit later lecture. When we talk next week, we're going to refer back to this. But something you need to be aware of is that this is a tool that's very, very broad and open-ended. It's not just something where you can say, all right, 2 + 2, I'm going to have an equal 4. 2 + 2 can equal whatever you want, which if you're talking about accounting can be very, very dangerous. But if you're talking about just creation in general, can be very, very helpful to your brainstorming process. And that does it for today. I'll see you all on Monday for chapter 7, I believe.